August 15, 1956, Memphis, Tennessee, Graceland, before it was famous, 2:47 a.m. Elvis Presley sat at his kitchen table, unable to sleep, staring at a contract that would destroy his life. The document was 56 pages long, filled with legal language he didn't understand, clauses hidden within subclauses, terms buried in fine print that would trap him for the next 21 years. Across from him sat the man who had written that contract, a massive figure in a sweat-stained suit despite the electric fan whirring in the corner, Colonel Tom Parker. The cigar in his thick fingers glowed red in the darkness as he smiled that snake oil salesman smile. "Just sign it, my boy," Parker said, his voice smooth as bourbon. "Sign it and I'll make you the biggest star in the world. Bigger than Frank Sinatra, bigger than James Dean. You'll have everything you ever dreamed of." Elvis was 21 years old. He'd had 3 hit records that year: Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel. Girls screamed when he moved his hips on stage. Boys wanted to fight him or be him. He was becoming something America had never seen before: dangerous, sexual, electric. But he was still a poor kid from Tupelo, Mississippi. Still the boy who'd lived in a shotgun shack, whose father had gone to prison for check fraud, whose mother washed other people's clothes to put food on the table. And now this fat man in a white suit was promising him the world. All Elvis had to do was sign. What Elvis didn't know, what nobody would know for 21 years, was that the man sitting across from him wasn't really Colonel Tom Parker. He wasn't even American. His real name was Andreas van Kuijk, an illegal immigrant from Holland who had entered the United States with forged papers and he was running for murder. A woman named Anna van den Enden had been found beaten to death in Breda, Holland, in May 9. The main suspect in her killing had disappeared the same week, fled to America, changed his name, and spent the next 27 years reinventing himself as a Southern gentleman and carnival promoter. But that night in Graceland, Elvis knew none of this. He only knew that Colonel Parker had connections, that Parker had managed successful country singers like Eddie Arnold and Hank Snow, that Parker was promising him Hollywood, television, fame beyond imagination. Elvis's mother, Gladys, sat in the doorway watching. She didn't trust Parker, had told Elvis so repeatedly over the past 3 months since Parker had first approached them. "There's something wrong with that man," Gladys had said. "His eyes are cold, like a dead fish. He doesn't care about you, Elvis. He only cares about money." But Elvis's father, Vernon, liked Parker, liked him very much, because Parker had been slipping Vernon envelopes of cash for months. $500 here, 1,000 there. For expenses, Parker would say with a wink. Vernon Presley had been poor his entire life, had worked brutal jobs for pennies, had humiliated himself for money more times than he could count. And now this wealthy carnival man was treating him with respect, giving him cash, making him feel important. Vernon had told Elvis to sign with Parker, had insisted on it. And Elvis, who loved his father despite everything, who wanted to believe that someone with experience and connections could guide him through this new world of fame and money, Elvis picked up the pen. "My boy," Parker said, leaning forward, "you won't regret this. I'll take care of everything. You just sing and smile for the pretty girls. I'll handle the business. That's what managers do." Elvis signed his name on page 56, a signature that would cost him everything. What Elvis didn't read, what Parker made sure he wouldn't read, were the clauses buried throughout those 56 pages. Clauses that would give Parker total control over every aspect of Elvis's life. Clauses that would allow Parker to steal millions. Clauses that would trap Elvis in a contract that wouldn't end until he was dead. From that moment, Elvis Presley wasn't a free man. He was a product, a commodity, a money-making machine owned by a man whose real name he didn't even know. And the tragedy was that Elvis wouldn't realize the truth until it was far too late to escape. Part 1. The Carnival Con Man, July 1950. Tom Parker had spent 30 years perfecting his greatest talent, exploitation. He'd started in carnival work back in Holland before the murder, running rigged games and freak shows where the freaks were often desperate people he'd convinced to degrade themselves for pennies. When he'd fled to America in 1929, he'd brought those skills with him. By 1955, Parker had worked his way up from carnival barker to music manager, but his philosophy remained the same: find someone with talent, take control of them completely, and extract every possible dollar before they realized what was happening. He'd done it with country singer Eddie Arnold, taking 25% of Arnold's earnings while simultaneously charging Arnold for expenses that often exceeded the commission itself. When Arnold finally got wise and fired Parker in 1953, Parker had walked away with nearly $1 million while Arnold was left paying debts Parker had created in Arnold's name. But Parker needed a new star, a bigger star, someone who could make the kind of money that would satisfy Parker's secret addiction: gambling. Parker lost fortunes at poker tables and horse races, often $50,000 in a single night. He needed someone who could generate that kind of cash flow constantly, indefinitely. Then he saw Elvis Presley performing at a small venue in Texas, and Parker knew he'd found his masterpiece. Elvis was everything Parker had been searching for: young enough to be manipulated, talented enough to be huge, poor enough to be desperate, and naive enough to trust a man in an expensive suit who promised him the moon. Parker spent the next 6 months studying Elvis, not just his performances but his family dynamics, his relationships, his vulnerabilities. He learned that Elvis was deeply attached to his mother Gladys, who was overprotective and suspicious of outsiders. He learned that Elvis's father Vernon was weak-willed and could be bought. He learned that Elvis had been poor his entire life and was terrified of going back to poverty, and Parker crafted his approach accordingly. He worked through Elvis's current manager Bob Neal first, positioning himself as a helpful consultant rather than a rival. He gave Vernon cash to ensure Vernon would advocate for him. He played the role of the wise, experienced music industry professional who only wanted what was best for the boy. By January 1956, Parker had maneuvered Bob Neal completely out of the picture, not through direct confrontation, but through bureaucratic manipulation. Parker created contracts so complex that Neal couldn't understand them. He scheduled appearances that conflicted with Neal's existing bookings, making Neal look incompetent. He planted doubts in Elvis's mind about whether a local Memphis DJ could really handle national-level career management, and when Neal finally gave up and walked away, Parker swooped in as Elvis's sole manager. Gladys Presley's instincts had been correct. There was something deeply wrong with Tom Parker, but by the time anyone realized it, Parker had already won. The contract he presented to Elvis in August 1956 was a masterpiece of legal manipulation. On the surface, it looked standard: a 25% management commission, renewable yearly, with Parker handling all business arrangements. But buried in the dense legal language were clauses that gave Parker unprecedented control. Section 14, paragraph C stated, "Manager shall have exclusive authority to negotiate all contracts, appearances, and business arrangements on behalf of the artist. Artist agrees to accept all arrangements made by manager without right of refusal or modification." Translation: Elvis couldn't say no to anything Parker decided. If Parker wanted to book Elvis for 100 shows in a month, Elvis had to do them. If Parker wanted to sign Elvis to a movie deal without Elvis reading the contract, Elvis had to accept it. Parker had veto power over Elvis's entire career. Section 22, paragraph A stated, "In the event of expenses incurred during promotion, tour arrangement, or career advancement, such expenses shall be recouped from artist's earnings before calculation of manager's percentage, with manager having sole discretion to determine reasonableness of said expenses." Translation: Parker could spend whatever he wanted on anything he claimed was a business expense, and Elvis would pay for it before Parker even took his 25% commission. If Parker wanted to stay in a $10,000 a night penthouse suite in Las Vegas and charge it as a business meeting location, Elvis would pay for it. If Parker wanted to hire his nephew as a consultant for $50,000 a year, Elvis would pay for it. And Elvis had no right to question whether these expenses were legitimate. Section 31, paragraph F stated, "This agreement shall remain in effect for the lifetime of the artist, and shall be binding upon the artist's estate, heirs and assigns in perpetuity." Translation: The contract didn't end when Elvis died. Parker would continue to control and profit from Elvis's image, recordings, and legacy forever. Even death wouldn't free Elvis from Colonel Tom Parker. Elvis didn't read these clauses carefully. His father told him the contract was standard. Parker told him every major star signed something similar. And Elvis, who had just turned 21, who was exhausted from touring, who trusted that adults with experience were looking out for his interests, Elvis signed without understanding what he was signing. From that moment forward, Elvis Presley belonged to Tom Parker, not in the legal sense of slavery, but in the practical sense of total control, and Parker would use that control to extract every possible dollar from Elvis's talent, even if it killed him, which eventually it did. Part 2: The Trap closes. September 1956, 2 weeks after signing. The first sign that something was wrong came when Elvis tried to tour internationally. His music was exploding across Europe. Teenagers in London, Paris, Berlin were going crazy for this new American sound. Promoters were offering huge sums for Elvis to perform overseas. One British promoter offered $500,000 for a 2-week tour of England. Elvis was excited. He'd never been to Europe. The idea of seeing other countries, performing for international audiences, experiencing the world beyond Tennessee, it thrilled him. But Parker said no, absolutely not. Not now, not ever. Too complicated, my boy, Parker explained. International touring involves work permits, tax complications, logistical nightmares. We'll make plenty of money right here in America. Elvis was confused. $500,000 seemed like a lot to turn down. But Parker was the expert, so Elvis deferred to his judgment. The real reason Parker refused had nothing to do with logistics. The truth was that Parker couldn't leave the United States. As an illegal immigrant with forged papers, he had no passport. If he tried to get one, if he tried to travel internationally, his real identity,
Andreas van Kuijk, wanted for questioning in a Dutch murder case, would be discovered. So Elvis never toured Europe, never performed in England or France or Germany or Japan, despite massive demand. Millions of dollars in potential earnings were lost because Parker was protecting his secret identity, and Elvis never knew why. The second sign came when Elvis got his first royalty statement from RCA Records in November 1956. Elvis had sold over 10 million records that year. His singles dominated the charts. Heartbreak Hotel alone had sold over 2 million copies. Elvis expected his royalty check to be enormous. Instead, it was $41,000. That doesn't seem right, Elvis told Parker. Don't I get paid more for all those records? Parker smiled reassuringly. That's after expenses, my boy. Recording costs, promotional materials, distribution fees, it all adds up. But don't worry, we're making plenty from your live shows and the Hollywood contract I just negotiated. What Parker didn't mention was that he had negotiated a special deal with RCA, where Parker himself received payments directly from the label, payments that didn't appear on Elvis's royalty statements. Parker was essentially being paid twice, once as Elvis's manager taking 25%, and again through this side deal with RCA that Elvis knew nothing about. The Hollywood contract Parker had negotiated was even worse. Paramount Pictures agreed to pay Elvis $100,000 per film, which sounded impressive in 1956. $100,000 per film, which sounded impressive in 1956. $100,000 per film, but buried in that contract, which Elvis never saw before Parker signed it on his behalf, was a clause stating that Elvis would make 3 films per year for 7 years, and that Paramount had final approval over all song selections, co-stars and directors. This meant Elvis had no creative control over his own movies. He couldn't choose which films to make. He couldn't refuse roles he didn't like. For the next 7 years he would make whatever garbage Paramount wanted him to make, and he'd have no say in it. And Parker had negotiated this deal without ever asking Elvis what kind of movies he wanted to make, or whether 7 years of artistic slavery sounded acceptable. When Elvis first read through the Paramount contract months after it was signed, he was horrified. I wanted to make serious films, he told Parker. Real dramas. I want to be a real actor, not just sing songs in beach movies. You are a real actor, Parker said smoothly, and these films will make you a star. Trust me, my boy. I know what I'm doing. But Parker didn't care about Elvis's artistic ambitions. Parker cared about guaranteed money. The Paramount deal meant 21 films over 7 years, each paying at least $100,000. That was $200 million minimum, with Parker taking 25%, $525,000 without having to worry about whether the films were good or whether Elvis was happy making them. By early 1957, Elvis was starting to feel trapped. He was making money, lots of money, but he had no control over his career. Every decision was made by Parker. Every contract was signed by Parker. Every business arrangement was negotiated by Parker, often without consulting Elvis at all. And when Elvis tried to push back, tried to assert some control over his own life, Parker would remind him of Section 14, Paragraph C. Artist agrees to accept all arrangements made by manager without right of refusal. You signed the contract, my boy, Parker would say, his smile never wavering. This is how the business works. Elvis didn't realize yet that this wasn't how the business worked. This was how Colonel Tom Parker worked. And by the time Elvis finally understood the difference, it would be too late to escape. Part 3. The Golden Cage, 1958. Elvis in the Army. When Elvis was drafted into the Army in March 1958, many people thought it would ruin his career. 2 years away from recording and performing seemed like an eternity in the fast-moving world of rock and roll. Surely some new singer would take Elvis's place while he was gone. But Parker saw the draft differently. He saw it as an opportunity, not for Elvis, but for himself. While Elvis was stationed in Germany, Parker continued to collect 25% of all Elvis's earnings from his existing record catalog, film royalties, and merchandising. Elvis was making almost no new money. Army pay was only $78 per month, but Parker was still pulling in hundreds of thousands annually from Elvis's past work. More importantly, Parker used Elvis's absence to renegotiate all of Elvis's contracts in ways that gave Parker even more control. He convinced RCA to let him manage Elvis's entire catalog, which meant Parker could approve or deny any compilation albums, reissues, or special releases. He restructured the Paramount film deal to extend it to 10 years instead of 7, adding more films Elvis would be contractually obligated to make. And he created merchandising deals where Parker took 50% instead of his usual 25%, claiming that the extra work of managing a client who was overseas justified the increased commission. Elvis, who was busy being a soldier in Germany, had no idea any of this was happening. Parker would send him cheerful letters. Don't worry about a thing, my boy. I'm keeping everything running smoothly. You just focus on serving your country. When you come home, you'll be bigger than ever. Parker was right about that. When Elvis returned from the army in March 1960, he was even more famous than when he'd left. The absence had created massive pent-up demand. His first post-army single, Stuck on You, sold over 1 million copies in the first week. But Elvis himself had changed. The 2 years in Germany had given him time to think, to mature, to realize that maybe he didn't want to spend his entire life making formulaic rock and roll movies. He'd become friends with serious actors during his army service. He'd read books about method acting. He dreamed about making films like Rebel Without a Cause or On the Waterfront, real dramas that showcased actual acting talent. When he came home and told Parker about these ambitions, Parker dismissed them immediately. "Those art films don't make money, my boy. You know what makes money? Elvis Presley singing songs and kissing pretty girls on screen. That's what your fans want. That's what the studios will pay for. That's what we're going to do." Elvis tried to argue. He was 25 years old now, not the naive 21-year-old who'd signed Parker's contract. He'd seen the world. He'd grown up. But Parker simply pulled out the contract. Section 14, paragraph C. Manager has exclusive authority. Artist agrees to accept all arrangements. You signed this, Elvis. You gave me the authority to make these decisions, and I'm making them based on what's best for your career, which is what's best for making money. Now you're starting GI Blues next month. It's a musical comedy set in the army. Paramount loves it. The script is already written. You're going to sing 12 songs and get the girl. The fans will eat it up. Elvis wanted to refuse, wanted to tear up the contract and find a new manager who would actually listen to his artistic ambitions, but he couldn't. The contract was ironclad, lifetime binding. The only way out was if Parker voluntarily released him, which Parker would never do, or if Elvis could prove fraud in court, which would take years of expensive litigation and might not even succeed. So Elvis made GI Blues, and then he made Flaming Star, which had a good script and let him actually act, and Elvis thought maybe things were changing. But Parker killed Flaming Star through terrible promotion. The film barely made money, which Parker used as proof that serious Elvis movies didn't work. "See, my boy," Parker said, "the fans don't want you in dramas. They want you in musicals. So that's what we're making." For the next 8 years, Elvis would make nothing but formulaic musical comedies. 3 per year, sometimes 4. Blue Hawaii, Girls, 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 Kissin' Cousins, Harem Scarum, Garbage, Embarrassing Garbage. Critics mocked him. The Beatles called his movies a joke. Bob Dylan said Elvis had sold out. Even Elvis's own fans began to drift away, bored by the repetitive formula. But Parker didn't care. Each film paid Elvis at least $500,000 by the mid-1960s, and Parker was taking not just his 25% commission, but also massive expense charges, $100,000 per film for promotional costs that never seemed to actually promote anything. Elvis was trapped in his golden cage, making terrible movies, watching his artistic credibility evaporate, unable to escape the contract he'd signed when he was too young to understand what he was signing. And the worst part? Parker had structured everything so that Elvis needed to keep making these movies, because Parker had been spending Elvis's money faster than Elvis could earn it.
Part 4. The Financial Trap. Elvis's accountant discovers the problem. Elvis's business manager, a man named Vernon Presley. Elvis's father wasn't sophisticated about finances, but even Vernon could tell something was wrong when he looked at Elvis's bank statements in 19... Elvis had made approximately $5 million in the past year. He'd made 4 movies, sold millions of records, and done a handful of concert appearances. After taxes, he should have netted around $2.5 million, but his actual bank balance had only increased by $400,000. Where had the other $2.1 million gone? Vernon brought this to Parker's attention. Parker explained patiently that there were expenses. "What kind of expenses?" Vernon asked. Parker pulled out a thick ledger. Production costs for the films, $200,000. Promotional tour expenses, $150,000. Office overhead for managing Elvis's career, $300,000. Legal fees, $180,000. Concert production costs, $220,000. Management consulting fees, $400,000. "Shall I continue?" Vernon stared at the numbers. They seemed impossibly high, but Parker was explaining them so confidently, with such detailed documentation, that Vernon felt stupid questioning them. "And don't forget," Parker added, "I take my 25% after these expenses are deducted. So if Elvis grosses $5 million and expenses are $2 million, that leaves $3 million. I take 25% of that, $750,000. So Elvis nets $2.25 million before taxes." The math seemed legitimate, but Vernon had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He hired an independent accountant to review Parker's books. The accountant found several problems immediately. First, many of Parker's expenses were questionable at best, fraudulent at worst. The $300,000 for office overhead was going to a company Parker owned. The $400,000 for management consulting was being paid to Parker's associates for work that was never actually performed. The promotional tour expenses were for tours that never happened. Second, Parker was double billing. He would charge Elvis for an expense, then also charge that same expense against Elvis's royalties from RCA or film payments from Paramount. Elvis was paying for the same thing twice. Third, Parker had been forging Elvis's signature on contracts and checks for years. Documents Elvis had never seen, agreements Elvis had never approved, expenses Elvis had never authorized, all bore Elvis's signature, but the handwriting analysis suggested many weren't authentic. Fourth, and most damning, Parker's commission wasn't really 25%. Through his various expense charges, side deals, and hidden fees, Parker was actually taking closer to 50% of Elvis's gross earnings. Over the past 8 years since 1956, Parker had personally received approximately $7 million from Elvis's career. Elvis, during that same period, had netted about $8 million after taxes. The accountant brought these findings to Vernon. Vernon brought them to Elvis. And for the first time, Elvis understood the full scope of Parker's theft. "He's been stealing from me," Elvis said quietly, "for 8 years. Millions of dollars. We can sue him," Vernon said. "We have evidence of fraud, forged signatures. We could get out of the contract." Elvis thought about it, thought about what a lawsuit would mean. Years of litigation, his private finances exposed in court, every embarrassing detail of his naivety made public, the humiliation of admitting he'd been conned, and even if he won, even if he could prove fraud and break the contract, what then? Parker had stolen millions, but he'd also made Elvis millions. Parker had the connections, the relationships with RCA and Paramount, and every major venue in America. If Elvis fired Parker, and Parker decided to retaliate, Parker could use those relationships to destroy Elvis's career. It was the perfect trap. Elvis couldn't escape without risking everything. So Elvis made the most tragic decision of his life. He decided to do nothing. He'd keep working with Parker, keep making the terrible movies, keep letting Parker steal from him. Because the alternative, fighting Parker in court, potentially destroying his own career in the process, seemed even worse. "Just keep an eye on him," Elvis told Vernon. "Make sure he doesn't steal more than he already has." But of course Parker would steal more, much more. Because now Parker knew that Elvis knew about the theft and had chosen not to fight back. That made Elvis not just a victim, but a willing victim. And Parker would exploit that weakness until it killed him. Part 5. The Vegas Trap. Elvis's comeback, or Parker's payday. By 1969, Elvis hadn't performed live in 8 years. The terrible movies had killed his film career. His records weren't selling as well. The British invasion had made him seem old-fashioned. At 34, Elvis Presley was in danger of becoming a has-been. But Elvis wanted to perform again. He missed the connection with live audiences. He missed the energy of being on stage, and he knew that if he could just get in front of people again, he could prove he was still relevant. Parker had resisted this for years. Live performances were unpredictable. Movie paychecks were guaranteed. But by 1969, even Parker had to admit the movie money was drying up. Studios weren't interested in Elvis musicals anymore. So Parker negotiated a deal with the International Hotel in Las Vegas. 57 shows over 4 weeks, $500,000 total. Elvis was thrilled. This was his chance to reinvent himself. But Parker had negotiated more than just one engagement. Hidden in the contract Elvis never saw was a clause committing Elvis to perform at the International Hotel twice a year, every year for the next 5 years. 100 shows per year minimum. Why would Parker commit Elvis to such a brutal schedule without asking him? Because Parker had a gambling problem, a serious gambling problem, and he owed the Las Vegas casinos over $2 million. The casino owners made Parker a deal. "Bring us Elvis Presley for regular engagements, pack our showroom twice a year, and we'll forgive your gambling debts. Plus, we'll extend you unlimited credit at our tables." Parker agreed immediately. He didn't care that 100 shows per year would exhaust Elvis. He didn't care that Vegas residencies would prevent Elvis from touring internationally or doing other creative projects. He cared that his gambling debts would disappear, and he could keep gambling on casino credit. So Elvis performed his heart out in Vegas, and the shows were phenomenal. Critics raved, audiences went crazy. Elvis proved he was still the king, and Parker immediately booked him for another 100 shows the next year. "Why so many shows?" Elvis asked. "Can't we do less and maybe tour other cities?" "The International pays top dollar, my boy," Parker explained. "Why travel around the country playing different venues when we can stay in one place and make guaranteed money?" The real reason was Parker's gambling debts and his unlimited credit line. As long as Elvis was performing at hotels owned by Parker's casino creditors, Parker could gamble freely. By 1972, Elvis was performing 150 shows per year in Vegas, 2 shows a night, sometimes 3. His voice was strained, his body was breaking down. He'd gained weight because he was too exhausted to exercise. He was taking pills to stay awake during shows, pills to sleep afterward, pills for pain, pills for everything. And Parker kept booking more shows. Because Parker's gambling addiction had gotten worse, he was now losing $50,000 a night at the tables, sometimes $100,000. In one particularly bad week, he lost $800,000. The only way to cover these losses was to work Elvis harder. When Elvis begged for a break, Parker would say, "Just a few more shows, my boy, we've got commitments." The commitments were Parker's gambling debts being paid with Elvis's sweat and blood. Part 6. The Breaking Point. July 1973. Elvis confronts Parker. Elvis finally reached his breaking point in July 19. He'd been performing non-stop for 4 years. He was exhausted, addicted to prescription drugs. His marriage was falling apart, and he felt like a prisoner in his own life. He called Parker to his suite at the International Hotel and told him he was done. "I'm not doing any more Vegas shows. I need a break. I need time to rest, to get healthy, to see my daughter." Parker's smile never wavered. "We have contracts, Elvis. Binding contracts. You agreed to these shows. I never agreed to any of this. You signed those contracts without asking me. I have power of attorney, Elvis. I'm authorized to sign on your behalf. That's what you agreed to in 19... I was 21 years old. I didn't know what I was signing. Nevertheless, you signed it, and the contracts are valid." Elvis felt rage building in him. "I want to see those Vegas contracts. I want my lawyer to review them. I want to know exactly what you've committed me to." Parker hesitated, just for a moment, but Elvis saw it. "You forged my signature, didn't you?" Elvis said quietly. "Like you've been forging it for years." Parker stood up, his bulk intimidating in the small room. "Be very careful about making accusations you can't prove, Elvis." "I can prove it. I can hire handwriting experts. I can subpoena the contracts. You can do nothing." Parker interrupted, his voice cold now. "Because if you try to fight me, I'll destroy you. I'll tie you up in lawsuits for years. I'll freeze your bank accounts. I'll make sure you can't record, can't perform, can't make a single dollar. And while you're fighting me in court, you'll be spending millions on lawyers, money you'll have to borrow, because I control your cash flow. You'll lose your house, your cars, everything. And even if you eventually win, which you won't, you'll be bankrupt and broken." Elvis stared at him. "You'd really do that? After everything we've been through?" Parker's smile returned. "My boy, you're not my friend. You're not my family. You're a product that generates revenue. And I'll do whatever is necessary to protect my investment." In that moment, Elvis understood something he'd been avoiding for 17 years. Colonel Tom Parker didn't care about him at all. Never had. Elvis was just a money-making machine, and Parker would run that machine until it broke. And when it broke, Parker would find a way to keep making money from the pieces. Elvis left that meeting knowing he was trapped, completely trapped. The contract he'd signed at age 21 had given Parker control over his entire life, and Parker would maintain that control until Elvis died. Which, increasingly, Elvis was starting to think might be soon, because the pills, the exhaustion, the stress, the despair, it was all too much. His body was breaking down, his spirit was broken, and Parker kept booking more shows. His drug addiction spiraled out of control. He was taking uppers to perform, downers to sleep, painkillers constantly. His doctor, George Nicopolis, Dr. Nick, prescribed whatever Elvis wanted because Parker had made it clear that keeping Elvis working was more important than keeping Elvis healthy. "Just keep him functional," Parker told Dr. Nick. "That's all I need. Keep him functional enough to get through the shows." Dr. Nick would later testify that he prescribed over 10,000 pills to Elvis in the final year of his life. Amphetamines, barbiturates, opiates, sedatives. Elvis's body was being chemically destroyed. But Elvis kept performing because Parker kept booking shows. 150 shows in 140 in 1976, 55 in 1977 before he died in August. Elvis would forget lyrics on stage. He'd slur words. He'd sometimes fall asleep between songs. Videos from those final shows are painful to watch. A bloated, confused man struggling to remember who he used to be. His friends begged him to stop performing, to go to rehab, to save himself. But Elvis couldn't stop. The contracts Parker had signed committed him to shows through 19. If Elvis stopped performing, he'd be in breach of contract, facing lawsuits for millions of dollars. So he kept going, kept taking pills to function, kept pushing his broken body through one more show, one more night, one more week, and Parker kept collecting his commissions and paying off his gambling debts with Elvis's blood. On August 16, 1977, Elvis was found dead on his bathroom floor at Graceland. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia, heart attack, but the autopsy told the real story. 14 different drugs in his system, toxic levels of codeine, a lethal combination of central nervous system depressants. Elvis didn't die of a heart attack. He died of an overdose. His body had simply reached the limit of what it could endure,
and Colonel Tom Parker had worked him to that limit deliberately, methodically, over 21 years. When told of Elvis's death, Parker's first words weren't grief or shock, they were business. "This changes nothing," Parker said to Vernon Presley. "The contracts continue. I still manage the estate. We've got merchandising deals to finalize." Elvis wasn't even buried yet, and Parker was already figuring out how to keep making money from him. Immigrant, the truth comes out. 1980. The estate fights back. 3 years after Elvis's death, his estate finally took legal action against Colonel Tom Parker. Priscilla Presley, Elvis's ex-wife and the executor of his estate, hired lawyers to investigate Parker's management of Elvis's career and finances. What they discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. Parker had taken approximately $20 million from Elvis over 21 years, possibly as much as $50 million if all the hidden fees and side deals were counted. Parker had forged Elvis's signature on hundreds of documents. He had made deals that benefited himself while harming Elvis financially and artistically. He had prevented Elvis from touring internationally to protect his own secret identity. He had worked Elvis to death to pay off his own gambling debts. In 1981, a court ruled that Parker had breached his fiduciary duty to Elvis and had engaged in self-dealing, fraud, and gross mismanagement. The estate was awarded $10 million in damages, a fraction of what Parker had stolen, but at least some justice. The ruling also revealed Colonel Tom Parker's real identity, Andreas van Kuijk, illegal immigrant from Holland, wanted for questioning in a 1929 murder investigation. Parker never faced criminal charges for the murder. Too much time had passed, and the evidence was circumstantial, but his reputation was destroyed. He spent the last years of his life broke, sick, and alone. He died in 1997, 20 years after Elvis, having outlived the man he'd exploited. The contract Elvis signed on August 15, 1956 at age 21 destroyed his life. It gave a con man total control over one of the greatest talents in American history. It turned a brilliant performer into a continue money-making machine. It prevented him from reaching his full artistic potential. It worked him to exhaustion, addiction, and death. And Elvis never escaped it, not even in death, because the contract was lifetime plus perpetuity. That's the truth about the Colonel's contract. It wasn't a partnership. It was slavery dressed up in legal language, and by the time Elvis understood what he'd signed, it was too late to do anything but die trying to fulfill its terms. Some people say Elvis killed himself with drugs, but the truth is that Colonel Tom Parker killed Elvis, slowly, methodically, over 21 years by working him to death to pay off gambling debts while stealing millions. Elvis Presley deserved better. He deserved managers who cared about his artistry, his health, his dreams. Instead, he got a carnival con man running from murder who saw him as nothing but a revenue stream. The Colonel's contract, the 56 pages that trapped the king, the legal document that destroyed the greatest entertainer of the 20th century. And it all started with a signature at 2:47 a.m. on a hot August night in Memphis, when a naive 21-year-old believed a fat man in a white suit who promised him the world. Instead, that man took everything Elvis had, and when there was nothing left to take, he let Elvis die.